David, thank you so very much for joining us today. What an honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you about your awesome work, African founders, and how enslaved Africans really helped to embody American democracy and principles. It's just a delight. So thank you again for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So could you please share with me, David, and our podcast listeners, what inspired you to write this particular book at this moment in history?
Most of my work arose from a question about how we built a free and open society, a republic in the United States through
Yes.
the past 400 years, something like that. And most of my work has been about that. I will mention one other book.
Yes, please.
This. It's a book called Albion's Seed, which is about different groups of people who came from England or Britain mostly to the United States, and they brought with them very different purposes, different religions, different ways of getting on with each other. And they founded different regional cultures in America.
Mm-hmm.
And then after I did that book, then I went on to do a book about Canada called Champlain Stream, which is that's the same sort of a question about how different groups came to Canada in a similar process. And then after that, it was about the movement of Africans to the New World. And that was the beginning of African founders. And the main theme in all of those books was about diversity. It was about many different groups who came to this new world and found ways of getting on with people who were not like themselves. And right. that's what's going on here. And then I've always approached these books in the same way, they're different as they are in substance. And the first rule for my kind of history is go there, go to wherever they came from.
Which I love, yes.
And get on the ground and meet people and talk with them. And so my wife, Judy's a botanist and a biologist who married a historian, and we both botanized and historicized together. And we went, we've been doing this for now going on 60 years. And,
wow. Wow. At another time, you'll have to talk to us about that. That's amazing. And congratulations on the 60-year marriage.
A scientist's rigor and also a great love for people that she works with. And so that's she's fundamental to what's going on here. So what we did was to go there. And after having gone to different parts of Britain and Europe, we then went to different parts of Africa. We would try to go in periods, but we were both teaching full time. And so the best time to travel was between our semesters in January and February. And so we went to the various parts of Africa from whence Africans came to America, which was a long stretch of a very large coastline from Senegal in the north, the big bulge of West Africa, down to Congo and Angola, it was that very, very large area, larger than the United States in some ways.
Right. Yes, I was going to raise that. That is an exceptionally large location.
Diverse. And so we went to about 9 different parts of Africa.
Wow.
Traveling on our own with young people traveling with us. We usually worked with a translator who could, it would vary from whichever part of Africa we were visiting. And then we would have a driver. The translator would often be a young woman and the driver would be a young man. Often he was a soldier off duty. And so the 4 of us then traveled to these different parts of it. We got into almost every part, not every part. One place we're not able to get to was Angola, which was, while we were working on all of this, was engulfed in a civil war.
Right.
And it was the state that we followed the advice of the State Department, and were advised not to go there as long as the war was in progress. And so I that's unfinished business. But we got to the other to most of the other regions. We would try to get out to African villages. We would travel through the countryside and try to meet and talk with people about their culture, about their memories of others who went to America, and that sort of thing. And then after we did all of that, we traveled in America, and we went to the regions that they came to, from New England down to Louisiana. And we worked, again, meeting people in all of these regions, talking with them, getting into the archives, exploring the culture in all of these places.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Maryland.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Please continue. Yeah.
Sorry, I will subside.
No. You were going to share about your roots in Maryland, so I do want you to share that information, and I'll jump in with my next question. So please go right ahead, David.
Well, then I was going to say that we began to work our way through these different cultures, and we found that there were profound differences. And as there were also amongst the European cultures, who brought the other people who interacted in the New World. And then we from New England down to Louisiana, we began to work through this in detail. And I should explain that I come from Maryland. I was born in 1935 in the midst of the Great Depression, and was a very small child in World War II, when every male of military age put on a uniform, and the war itself was very much a part of my early life. And then from there went on to school, to college, and then to graduate school, and then married a Yankee and moved to New England, and we've been living in New England ever since, and have raised a family of children and now grandchildren who are off doing all of their things in different ways.
Excellent. And it's the going there, David, that I want us to expand on a little more. And I'm really interested in hearing some of your additional perspectives around it, because, of course, there's the physical going there, right? But then there's also, as you had iterated a couple of times, in our conversation, it's this idea of going there kind of psychologically, going there with the intentionality of scientific rigor to ensure that the layers of the story of enslaved and then ultimately free Africans and their contributions to democracy unveils in a particular way in your specific book. Yes. So would you talk about how do you balance that going there, right? How do you see your work and support, with your wife's help, and everything that you shared what she's doing, how do you balance kind of synthesizing and gathering all of that empirical information with what we know to just be, an incredible topic, but one, of course, has degrees of emotionalism. And this is, to my knowledge, the first type of book that really sets forth the African contributions to democracy at a time in our nation, in the United States, where there's a lot of lightning rods happening in relationship to the future of our democracy. How do you balance that going there?
Well, let me answer by examples of what we did in the book.
Yes.
The book goes geographically. We start in New England, and in New England we are studying colonies founded by English Puritans for the most part, very different groups of English Puritans. And then they began to import African slaves, as did all of these other regions. And the Africans who came to New England were mostly what were called Akan-speaking, A-K-A-N, Akan-speaking slaves who came from sort of the coast of West Africa, the middle coast of West Africa, around what is now Ghana in particular.
Yes.
Stretching over to Nigeria, and in that broad area. And so we started with that pairing, and these Akan slaves were very interesting people, and very much conscious of their own culture. How do we know that? Mostly through interviews, through working with individual Africans in America, through their abundant records of slave narratives, the autobiographies of many slaves that began to be collected in the 19th century, and then we interviewed their descendants as well, and talked with them. And then we did the same thing with the people who were came from Europe, and began to study that, and we found that they all. It was interesting. We think of these were the Puritan colonies in New England, and we remember the Puritans for their religion, for the rigor of their faith, for the engagement in values that produced these open societies in New England, with strong town meeting governments and that sort of thing. And then we found that amongst Akan-speaking slaves who came from the coast of West Africa, we found that they also came from very rich and highly developed cultures. And they brought those cultures as well to New England. And the interplay was the first of 9 parts of this book. And then we followed that as we went for the next. I won't go down the full list, but the next list, we went geographically from north to south. And after that, after New England, we went to the Hudson Valley. Which included people not only from what is now New York, but also from what was then called East Jersey. People talked the Jerseys in early America. This was the eastern part of New Jersey, and in that area, and we studied that process in great detail, always trying to get back to original sources, people from the beginning recording their own experiences in great abundance. It's amazing how much survives in many different ways. And these were an abundance of slave narratives, which were collected in the 18th and 19th centuries, and survive in great abundance in the Library of Congress, most of all, but in many American archives. So we're reading the materials that were written by these people, telling us about their purposes, about what they did, how they felt about it. And then I tried to reconstruct that in 9 different regions of what is now the United States. And it's a wonderful story. And it's the diversity of it that is the key to this. It's our differences that keep us free. When we learn to be tolerant of others who are not like ourselves, but by learning more about them and learning to live with them, and then we began to see an incredible interplay of cultures in which Africans and Europeans borrowed from each other, learned from each other, and created something new, which was a new set of American cultures out of all of this. and creating it in different ways in our different regions. I celebrate diversity, and I think diversity is the key to what this country is all about. And we should, I think, we should cherish that. And my book celebrates that diversity and
It
tries to
absolutely
learn
does.
from the great range of human differences and human experiences.
Yes, yes, it is. It is a powerful book. I found myself at times being moved in a teary way as I was reading some of the stories of heroicism, that you have set forth in just this amazing work. And so it is with appreciation that you honor and celebrate diversity in this new context. And I want to talk a little bit about something that you touched on, David, in relation to the different regions. So as long as I've studied early Africans in the United States or in the early Republic, I hadn't come across any work like yours that really took this story to all of the United States, so typically, and largely because I think it was access to the records, or the historian's attempt to really just try to scope the story in a particular geographic location. But your book covers literally early African presence and contributions to democracy across this entire nation that we now refer to as the United States. So how challenging was it for you to unify, the complexity of these different regional histories into a single, historical work?
Well, what I did was to try to work, first of all, with these different regions, working. Let's take one example, which would be the Hudson Valley. There we have colonies that were founded, first of all, by Dutch merchants, entrepreneurs, and they had connections mainly through their trading links to Angola, the southern part of this long coastline. And so the linkage there was between these Dutch capitalists and Angolans, and many of the Angolans were people who were captured in Angola by slave traders, and many of them were Angolan entrepreneurs. They were in commerce in Angola, and they came to New Netherlands, and there was an interplay between these two cultures that created the culture that we now think of as New York. It celebrated and even reinforced diversity, as New Yorkers have always done, and then it expanded north and west and a little bit to the east, and built through the Hudson Valley, extending down as far as the middle part of New Jersey.
Okay.
Quite a broad area, and which had a very distinct character to it. It was very very much oriented toward commerce. Both the Dutch were mainly engaged in commerce, and then the Africans began to follow that way. Something very different happened in the colony that developed in the Delaware Valley, and that was mainly Pennsylvania and West Jersey, and that came a little bit later. Each of these were separate in time as well as in space, and the people who went to the Delaware Valley were led by Quakers, mostly English Quakers and Welsh Quakers too. Had a very different religious set of religious purposes and values from the Puritans of New England and from the Dutch entrepreneurs of the Hudson Valley. And they began to bring another group of slaves who came mostly from what they called Guinea at that time, which was the northern stretch of the slave coast in particular. And we had lots of quantitative projects to try to document where precisely their numbers came from. And we did that in every region. And again, we found that in 9 regions, every region was different, one from another, which created a compounded sort of diversity of different European cultures meeting different African cultures, creating different American regional cultures. And that diversity, which was diverse in 3 different ways, it was the base of this extraordinarily rich culture, which is now the United States. Mm-hmm. And I think the key is to perceive the importance of diversity in our country, and how important it is to keep it going, to keep open. It means we have to get used to living and working with people who are not like ourselves.
That is right. Absolutely.
That's the key. That's what's so critical to, and that's what my book is mainly pointed to.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And, as you shared throughout our conversation today, you talk a lot about, highlighting diversity and how it is essential and fundamental to our democracy. You talk about the later free Black communities, the resistance to slavery, and often, what I would describe as non-democratic principles, just a real pushback against what we believe America to be, and subsequently how these different communities really shaped America in a very positive way. Yep. And that really is the essence of the thesis of American founders, which is just fabulous, I think. And so what are some of the key takeaways readers should gather from your work, from your book?
Well, I think the first is to see the complexity of our differences in America, and how the strength of America and its creativity, I think, comes from the interplay of all of that.
Yes.
And I think it's sometimes it's not easy to get on with people who are different from ourselves, and yet as we do more of that, America grows stronger. That's what's mainly going on in this book. And I hugely enjoyed every one of these regions as I got into them. The region that was closest to my heart, I think, was the Chesapeake region, because that's where I was born and bred, where my roots happen to be. And Virginia there, and Maryland. My roots are in Maryland, but Virginia was the largest of all the colonies in early America. And it created the Virginia dynasty, who were most, all 4 of the first 5 presidents were all from Virginia. And the slaves who went there also produced a good number of the leaders of African organizations as well. And there was a remarkable sense of the development of the skills of leadership in open systems, where you have to lead by working with people who are very different from yourself. And
right, that's
and
right.
That's what these people love to do. And I grew up in this region, and I learned from my family, which included not only my parents and grandparents, but also an African-American woman named Flora Jackson, who worked for my mother and worked for my grandmother, and then worked for my wife, Judy, and looked after our daughters. She was an extraordinary person. She was very tall. She must have been over 6 feet tall.
Wow.
And she was
wow.
She helped both my mother and my grandmother and many others in our family in terms of running their own households. And she was really a manager of what happened in these houses, and brought in members of her own family to work with different families within my family. My mother was one of 5 children, and they all married and had children of their own. And these stories played out differently in different households. And Flora worked for all of us with other African Americans who she often recruited, and she was very important. She was. I remember her dignity. She was very strong, and with her, and her integrity. And she was very important in African American churches in Maryland, and so it was that sort of personal connection that was very much a part of all of this. And then after that, another culture that I really enjoyed getting into was what developed on the coast of Carolina. We worked with friends of ours in South Carolina, a wonderful colleague named Charles Joyner, Coastal Carolina College, who was a very dear friend, and we cherished him. And he helped us in many ways. And that culture was deeply interested interesting in the way that this also recruited from another group of Angolan slaves, different from the ones that went to New York. And they
brought
with them a culture that began to be called Gullah culture, which is derived from Angola. And Gullah culture is alive and well today. From the southern part of North Carolina down the full width of South Carolina and into Georgia. And that's an extraordinarily rich culture that has produced all sorts of things that have flourished in America. And then in some ways, the most creative was the culture that developed in Louisiana in the lower Mississippi Valley. It developed and most of all in New Orleans and around New Orleans. And that was a very, very rich culture, which had it was very mixed, much more mixed than any of the other cultures, because it was settled by the French, and then by the Spanish, and then by the English, and all of them. And then on top of that, there were many different groups of slaves who went to Louisiana. They were Bamana slaves from or Bambara slaves, as they're sometimes called, from upper West Africa, and others who came from Benin, and still others who came from Congo. And so there was a huge mixture in New Orleans, and it was the diversity of that created that wonderful culture that has produced so many things. It produced so much of American music. Jazz developed in this region, and it developed from the interaction of the musical traditions of Africans and of Europeans in the New World, in America. And New Orleans was its center, and we loved to go to New Orleans, and to get out and to go up and down the Mississippi there, and seeing there are many different. There's a great diversity within that culture, and
absolutely,
and to get to know that, and the richness of that diversity was a source of its inventiveness and its creativity in the music that became so important to American society, in the cuisine that became critical to American American life, and in much more. And then after that, from all of those, we've been through 6 cultures. There are 6 regional cultures. They're just in these few minutes. Then we went to the west and to the south, to the southern border, to maritime slaves along the Atlantic coast, to the culture of the herders who were sent onto the western frontier, raising animals. And they were Fulani herders who came from yet another part of Africa, and they intermixed with Carolina cattlemen, and then got connected with Texas Mustangers. And the result was a diversity compounded on itself that created the Western frontier culture.
Right.
That's a very important part of America. And
Absolutely.
then something interesting happened on the maritime coast of the Atlantic Ocean, and these were West African boatmen who got they got mixed up with European seamen and created American maritime traditions. And that's yet another part of the book. And the last unit was on the far southern frontier, particularly in Florida, where we got Angolan soldiers meeting for Spanish militia. And they produced the Seminole cultures that were so strong on this southern frontier. So there were 9 cultures, and there were lots of others, smaller ones in addition to that we note in passing as we go. And diversity is the key here. And as the diversity compounded on itself, America became more creative. It's what makes this country as creative as it is this incredible diversity. And that's what my work celebrates, both Africans and Europeans coming together to make Americans in this very mixed process.
Yes. Thank you. And my last question for you, David, is that you have Absalom Jones on the cover. And someone who I feel doesn't get enough recognition, historically speaking, in the context of his and actually Richard Allen's contributions to saving a good part of the region right in the middle of a major pandemic. And, you assert this idea of the African founders are founders of this nation, right? Which to some people could feel a little controversial. So in our last moments together, could you talk about why it was important to basically place up figures like Absalom Jones next to those that we would often consider to be the traditional names that come up as founding people, fathers, mothers of this nation?
Yes. Well, with the first is that there are what just totally amazed me was how many of these stories there were about the individual Africans, such as Absalom Jones, and how again the extraordinary variety of them, and how creative they were in many ways, and so it's an attempt to describe that in great detail, often going back to African American sources, looking for the autobiographies, the narratives that were collected in great abundance. Much of it happened in the early 20th century. It was a major New Deal project to interview. There were still, in the early 20th century, a fair number of people who had been slaves in their youth, often who had come from Africa. And they were interviewed in great detail. And there are thousands, something that we haven't, I worked with more than 4,000 of these individual slaves. And and there were many more than that. And we can read them in their own writings. And we can even, during the New Deal, they began to be interviewed and recorded. And so we can listen to them. We can hear their speeches. They're all of this is in the Library of Congress, and it's very accessible. And I spent a lot of my time listening to these slaves in America who had become free, telling their own stories, and then trying to learn from and trying to listen very carefully to what they wanted us to know, and then to try to pass that on to others. I see myself as helping to extend the reach of their voice to others in America today, because I think that the exchange is the continuing process of people listening to our forebears, and we can do that directly.
That's right.
We can sit down and hear them speak, and learn from them, directly from them. That's what I tried to do, and then I try to pass that on to people in the book. and so that we are getting to know them as directly as we can. So
great. David, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. And thank you for this amazing book. I have not put it down since I got it. I've been reading it and rereading it because it feels like every time I spend more time with it, there's a new illumination that I kind of want to explore for myself. But we appreciate your time. Thank you so very much for this interview.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk.
Absolutely.
And to listen.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. I feel like that, like to listen to you is incredible. And I would be remiss. And so our friend Scott Casper would be like, she didn't say it. So I do want to also say that it is a treat to be a member of the American Antiquarian Society along with you, and to just celebrate this with you as a colleague and a peer as well.
I would just say one other thing. It's talking is important and useful, but listening is even better.
Amen. I agree. Thank you again, David, for your time.